called the Day of Brahma. And during these cycles, which go very, very far back in time, human beings are always present. Right from the beginning of the cycles, not towards the end of the cycles, as most scientists now believe. And these ancient civilizations, they also spoke of ape men. Thousands of years ago, in the Vedic writings of India, they were talking about ape men that existed millions of years ago, just like scientists today are talking about this. But it's not a recent discovery. Long ago, the ancients knew that, yes, there were ape men existing, but alongside them were existing human beings like ourselves. Yes, not that one came from the other, as the current theory of evolution tells us. Rather, they were coexisting with each other in these ancient times. Millions and millions of years ago. And this brings us to another topic. We may still be coexisting with some of these ape men today. Brings us to the topic of Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the abominable snowman of the Himalayas, the Yeti. You find reports of these creatures which very much resemble the descriptions of the ape men that are supposed to have been gone extinct. So we are coexisting with them today, and we were coexisting with them millions and millions of years ago also. So the basic picture you get is not one of evolution, but of coexistence. Now, as Doyle said, if at any point any one of you have any question or comment you would like to make, I want you to feel free to do that. Raise a hand, ask whatever you want to ask, say whatever you want to say. So the ideas that I've just laid out for you, that human beings have existed on this planet for hundreds of millions of years, that we didn't evolve from the ape men, we coexisted with them. These are ideas that are very different than the ideas that come from Charles Darwin and his modern followers. You know, they have a different idea. Basically, they believe that life, began on Earth about 2 billion years ago, and they think, there were some microorganisms that self-organized from chemicals in the Earth's early ocean, then some fish developed, then other animals, until about 40 or 50 million years ago you get the first apes and monkeys, then about 6 million years ago the first ape men, and then finally about 100,000 years ago, they say, the first human beings like us appeared on Earth. Before that, there were no human beings like us, they say. And they say that all the physical evidence supports that idea. But when I did 8 years of research into the whole history of archaeology, I found something different. I found that over the past 150 years, archaeologists have discovered much evidence showing that humans like us have existed throughout this whole period of time. And this evidence takes the form of human skeletons, human artifacts, human footprints, many, many millions of years old, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life on Earth. But you're not going to read about this evidence in your textbooks because of what I call a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. You know, we can call this blue box here the knowledge filter. And what it represents is the fixed ideas most scientists now have about this question of human origins. Of course, this is the Darwinian idea that they have now. So reports of evidence that conform to these fixed ideas will pass through this filter very easily, which means students will read about this evidence in their textbooks. People will see scientists talking about it on television. If you go to the local museum, you'll see these things. But if we have evidence that radically contradicts these fixed ideas, it is filtered out, which means you're not going to read about it in the textbooks. You're not going to see scientists talking about it on television. And if you go to the local museum, you're not going to see these things, even though they may be there somewhere in the museum collections. So what I'd like to do now is go over some examples of the kind of evidence that I'm talking about. And I'm going to start with some evidence that's kind of close in time to what most scientists are now prepared to accept. As I said, most scientists now believe human beings like us first came into existence about 100,000 years ago. So I'm going to start with some cases that are older than that, but still sort of close to that. And then I'm going to go further, further, and further back in time. So this is Virginia Steen McIntyre. She's an American geologist who I know personally. She lives in Colorado. And when she was a young woman just beginning her scientific career, she was involved in dating an archaeological site called Huayatlaco in Mexico. It's in central Mexico. It's near the town of Puebla. And there, the archaeologists discovered many stone tools and weapons, and they may look kind of primitive to us, but according to archaeologists, they're the kind of things that only human beings of our type would have made. And they don't think that any kind of ape man could have made these things. So, of course, the archaeologists who dug these things up wanted to know how old they were. So they called a team of geologists to date the site. This is the archaeologist who was in charge of the excavation, Cynthia Irwin Williams. And this is the excavation at Huayatlaco. It was a very professional excavation. And as I said, they found stone tools and weapons in the solid rock in their excavations. This is one of the stone tools that they found. And they were solidly embedded in the rock. And they wanted to know how old these stone tools were. So they brought in a team of geologists. Virginia Steen McIntyre was the head of the team. So she and her colleagues used 4 different methods to date this site. First of all, they used the uranium series method to date some animal bones that were found in the same layers with the stone tools. These animal bones had cut marks on them, which means somebody was using those tools to butcher those animals, get the meat from them. So there aren't any scientific methods that will let them directly date the stone tool to tell when it was made into an artifact. So, but there is a method that they could date the bones, the animal bones that were found in the same layers with them. So the method they use is called the uranium series method. And using this method, they got a maximum age of about 245,000 years. So they also used another method to date this site, because above the layer with the stone tools, there was a layer of volcanic ash. So they were able to use the zircon fission track method to date that layer of ash. They got an age of 270,000 years. And then they used another method called tetrahydration, which confirmed these ages. And they also looked at the stratigraphy, the different layers. They could see that the artifact layers had originally been covered by about 150 feet of deposits that had gradually been worn down by erosion. So they knew the rate of erosion, so they could calculate how long it took for those layers to erode. So using all four methods that they used, the geologists concluded the site must be 250,000 years old. But the archaeologists said, that is impossible. Human beings capable of making these artifacts did not exist 250,000 years ago anywhere in the world. What to speak of North America? Because according to the current theories, no human beings entered North America until about 20,000 years ago. That's their theory. They believe that at that time, some people came over from Siberia into Alaska, down through Canada, down through the United States, down to Mexico, then from there to South America. So, of course, the Native American peoples don't believe that. They don't say our ancestors came here 20,000 years ago from Siberia. They don't say that at all. They've always been here, according to their theories, their beliefs. But so the archaeologists just said this is this date of 250,000 years is completely impossible. So they refused to publish the age for the site given by their own hand-picked team of geologists. You know, they invited these geologists to come there, date the site, and they came up with a date that they didn't like. So they refused to publish it. This is how this knowledge filtering process works. So Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues were a little upset by this. They say, we're just scientists doing our job. We can't help it if it contradicts your theory. This is the geology. This is the age of the site, 250,000 years. So what the geologists did is they independently publish the age for the site in this scientific journal. But when Virginia Steen McIntyre did that, she experienced an extreme negative backlash from her colleagues. in the world of geology. And they started calling her a troublemaker, a maverick, a publicity. See, how could you do this? How could you do such a thing? Don't you know that human beings didn't exist 250,000 years ago? Why are you doing this? So although she had been a rising star in her field of geology, after she published this paper, her career was effectively finished because she had dared to publish something that contradicted the Darwinian theory of evolution. That is something you just don't do in the academic and scientific world today. So she lost a teaching position that she held at a university. And as I said, her career was effectively finished at this point. So, these are the kinds of pressures that can be brought to bear on people like this. Yes?
I'd just like to know if these uranium series and zircon fission types of dating systems are accepted elsewhere in the scientific community, many times over.
Yes, they are. So the question is, for the benefit of the camera, they want me to repeat these questions. So the question is, are these uranium series dates and zircon fission track datings, are these accepted scientific methods? And yes, they are. But as with any scientific dating method, you can always start trying to say, well, it's got to be wrong somehow. Somebody did something wrong. Some samples were contaminated. But these are professionals who are doing these things, and they were very careful in what they did. So it appears that the main reason why they objected to these dates was because they contradicted the theory of evolution. Therefore, they decided something's got to be wrong with these dates. They must have made some mistake somehow, but they can't point out what the mistake is. It's sort of like maybe there's a building inspector and he's got a big list of rules. So maybe he goes, somebody's his friend. So he looks at his place and he says, okay, yeah, it's fine. But maybe there's somebody he doesn't like. And he starts going through the rule book. And you can always find something wrong. You can always find some little thing wrong. That's not the code there, sorry. We're going to have to shut you down. Or sometimes a policeman too. He can look at your car or something. You can find something wrong with it. Some reason to give you a ticket if he wants. So it's sort of like, it's a double standard. When these same methods are used in cases that give dates that support the accepted theories, all little flaws and details, they're just overlooked. But if the very same methods are used and they give a date that contradicts some deeply held theory, then they start looking for anything that could possibly be wrong. But another thing to keep in mind is that this case was completely buried in the 1990s. But I found out about this case in my research for my book, Forbidden Archaeology. And I included this case in that book, Forbidden Archaeology. Then there was a television producer in New York named Bill Coty. He was thinking about doing a documentary that he was calling The Mysterious Origins of Man. And somehow or other, he got a hold of my book, Forbidden Archaeology, and he read about some of these cases. So I became a consultant for the television program. I appeared on that program. It was a very, it appeared on NBC. It's called The Mysterious Origins of Man. And, I introduced him to Virginia Steen McIntyre, and he took her down to Mexico, and she showed him the site, explained the whole thing to him. So it was on national TV. And there was a wealthy gentleman who was interested in archaeology that decided who saw that program, and he decided to fund some new research. So there was some new research going on. There has been down there. There was, and what they have found, I believe, shows that the dates that Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues got are correct. They reaffirm the nature of her dates. They redid some of the dates. They came up with the same dates. And they even tried some new methods that also confirmed the dates that she originally got. So this story, it hasn't really ended yet. And I'm kind of happy to say that the work that I did kind of resulted in this case being reopened. And we'll see eventually what happens. But that's a very good question. So yes, this uranium series method, it is one of the standard scientific dating methods. The zircon fission track method is a standard scientific dating method. They're widely used by archaeologists and geologists and paleontologists to date things. Anyone else have something? Yes.
Has carbon-14, or the radiocarbon dating, has it been proven to be inaccurate?
These dating methods, I believe, are based on some sound scientific principles. But in any particular case, there could be a problem. For example, the radiocarbon method, the carbon-14 method that you just mentioned, is based on the idea there are two kinds of carbon in living things, carbon-14 and carbon-12. Carbon-12 is not radioactive. Carbon-14 is radioactive. If something's radioactive, that means it decays into other elements. And the rate of decay is expressed in what they call a half-life. That means, say if you start with a certain amount of carbon-14, then after the half-life of carbon-14 is about 5,000 years. So that means after 5,000 years, you have half of what you started out with. After another 5,000 years, you have half of what you started out with. After another 5,000 years, you got half of what you started out, of what was there. Then another 5,000 years, half, 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 half. By the time, so what happens is that your amount of carbon-12 stays the same. Your amount of carbon-14 gradually goes down. And by about 50,000 years there's not enough left to measure any more half-lives. So I mean, actually, if you go to a newer method of carbon-14 dating called accelerator mass spectrometry, they can take it back to about 100,000 years. So that method really wouldn't apply in this case here, because we're talking about things that are older than that. But here's something that could potentially happen, however. If a sample that you're trying to date, say like you have a bone that's really 1 million years old, if it got contaminated with the least amount of modern carbon-14, the bone, even though it's 1 million years old, would show an age of 100,000 years or less. And there's a lot of ways in which a bone can become contaminated with carbon. First of all, like even if you just touch it, you know the skin has oils on it. And those oils contain carbon-14. So just by even touching, like a bone, you could contaminate it with some recent carbon. Or it could come in from the groundwater. Say the bone's 1 million years old, but there's water coming down from the surface that has carbon in it, from fertilizers or just from the soil, or there could be bacteria that enter the bone and die there. Their bodies would have recent carbon-14 in them. So there's a lot of ways in which a sample could become contaminated with recent carbon. And so that even though a bone might be 1 million years old, if they dated it using this method, it would show an age of 100,000 years or less. So there have to be very, very careful purification techniques done when they're doing these dating methods to make sure that they're not dating recent carbon that may have contaminated the sample. It's possible to do these things, but so it's the same with all of these methods. They're based on sound scientific principles, but in any particular case, you would have to be careful. The main thing that they have to be careful of is contamination of the samples with recent elements, be they uranium or carbon or like that. So now some people who favor a very, very young age for the Earth would have more problems with these dating methods than I would. I accept a long age, for the Earth. People who believe in a very, very young age for the Earth, say 5,000 or 10,000 years, would have a lot more problems with these methods than I would. So that's something to keep in mind. Yes?
Who would you consider some of those people that would consider the age of 5,000 years?
Oh, okay. Like when my book Forbidden Archeology came out, Dwayne Gish of the Creation Research Society got a hold of a copy of it, and he really liked the book. He's a young Earth Christian creationist. And I went out and met him, and we had a lot that we agreed on. We just disagreed about the age of the Earth. So say my book Forbidden Archeology was reviewed by Creation Research Society Quarterly, which is the main scientific journal of the young Earth Christian creationists. movement. They gave it a very favorable review. And they said, although we disagree with Mr. Cremo, Mr. Thompson about the age of the Earth, we agree with them that human beings have been here since the beginning. So what I usually tell those folks is, well, whether the Earth is a few thousand or a few billion years old, human beings have been there since the beginning, and they didn't evolve from apes. So at least that much we agree on. We would have a disagreement about the age of the Earth. But even within, say, the Christian creationist movement, you've got same disagreement. There are some who accept a young age for the Earth. They're called young Earth creationists. Then they're old Earth creationists as well. So, that's. Personally, I don't claim to have a monopoly on truth. I think truth can be found in many places. And I was really happy that the young Earth Christian creationists liked my book, although they disagreed with me about the age of the Earth. So, to directly answer your question, that's who I was alluding to.
Could you repeat that name? Could you repeat that name, please?
Huh?
Could you repeat that name, please?
Dwayne Gish.
Dwayne Gish.
Yeah, he at least at the time, I don't know if he still is, he was one of the leaders of the in San Diego, there's a creation research organization that he was one of the leaders of. Yes.
Do you know maybe what their contention would be, and maybe why they wouldn't want to admit or accept or try to think that even that could be true, that the Earth is that much older, like in their philosophical doctrine, say? Do you have a opinion of why they wouldn't be able to accept that? Say something in the scripture that they cite, or what have you?
Of course, the best thing would be to ask Dwayne Gish about it, but as far as I know, I don't like to represent what other people say, but since you're asking this question, from what I can see is that they look at the genealogies in the Bible, and you can add up, this one lived for so many years, this one lived from so many years, all the way back to the time of the flood. That's something I also believe in. I believe there have been repeated catastrophes, on Earth, massive floods and things like that. But they think they can trace, by calculating the genealogies, they can trace it back, to about 5,000, 10,000 years, about something in that range. There are others who say that, looking at things from, like a biblical perspective. Like I said, I don't really like to talk so much about, how people, interpret their scriptures and things like that. But since you asked the question, from what I can tell, there's some that will say, there's some passages in the Bible that say one of his years, his being God's, are like 10,000 of ours or something. So they try to expand, what these years mean. And I'll let them settle that among themselves. But these are questions that come up, and I think they're legitimate questions. But the thing that we would agree on, although we might disagree about the age of the Earth, myself, and like I said, myself, I tend to approach things from the standpoint of the Vedic writings of India, which speak about these long time cycles. But what we would agree on is whether we think the Earth is a few thousand or a few billion years old, humans have always been there, and they didn't evolve from the apes. Anything else on this point? Okay, we'll go a little further ahead here. Oh, I was mentioning some of the new research that's gone on down there at Huayatlaco. There's another geologist named Sam Van Landingham from the United States who has studied the diatoms there. Diatoms are they're small little creatures that leave like a little kind of skeleton made out of calcium. And they're all different kinds. They sort of look like little calcium, if you look under a microscope, they're sort of like little snowflakes. They all have different little shapes and things like that. There are lots of diatoms, lots of kinds of these diatoms, they're called, these microscopic little living creatures that leave this little tiny skeleton. They're round. They're kind of round things. They leave these round, hard little skeletons. And there are hundreds of different kinds. And by studying the different kinds, you can tell what time period they belong to. So he said that the kinds of diatoms that you find at this site, Huayatlaco, support the ages that Virginia Steen McIntyre gave. So now we're going to go back a little further in time. This is a site at Schöningen in northern Germany. And there what the archaeologists found were wooden spears that were shaped exactly like modern Olympic javelins. They were obviously like a weapon that was made for throwing and killing animals. And actually, they found butchered animal bones along with these wooden spears. So they were found in layers of rock about 430,000 years old. And the archaeologists wrote an article about them in a scientific journal called Nature, which is considered to be the world's preeminent scientific journal. They wrote about these lower Paleolithic hunting spears. They were found in layers of rock about 430,000 years old. Now the problem was, who made them? Well, they decided it couldn't be human beings like us, because according to their theories, human beings like us did not exist 400,000 years ago. So who did exist 400,000 years ago? They believe it was an ape man that lived in Europe called Homo heidelbergensis. So they said, obviously, these spears had to have been made by this ape man. It's a variety of Homo erectus. That's a scientific name for this ape man. Now that was a bit unusual because before this time, nobody had ever thought this ape man could have done anything like that. They thought the only being capable, intelligent enough to make like these very, very well-made throwing spears for throwing and hunting and killing animals were human beings like us. They didn't believe that ape men had that ability. And actually, the oldest spears that they had before this discovery were less than 100,000 years old, within what they considered to be the range of our species, the time range of our human species, anatomically modern human species. So, but they said, okay, humans like us didn't exist 400,000 years ago. Only this ape man existed at that time. So it must have been this ape man who made those spears. But I think there's another explanation of who made those spears. And it has to do with some discoveries that were made in northern France in the 19th century by Jacques Boucher de Perthes, who was one of the founders of modern archaeology. He lived in the 19th century. Of course, Darwin lived in the 19th century. Einstein lived in the 19th century. I mean, a lot of people, they think, well, anything that was done in the 19th century, how could it possibly be true? Well, Darwin made his theory of evolution in the 19th century too. So if you want to say that we can't accept anything that was done in the 19th century, you might as well give up Darwin too. I don't believe that all science that was done, before, January 1st, 1900 is bad science. But in any case, he made some discoveries in northeastern France at a place called Abbeville. And one of the things he found was this human jaw. It's an anatomically modern human jaw, just like that of a modern human being. And he found it in this layer of his excavation, along with many stone tools and weapons. And according to modern geologists, this layer here at Abbeville is about 430,000 years old. Now, at the time of this discovery, it was very controversial because many scientists could not believe that humans existed so far in the past. They thought, this is impossible. So some of them came up with an explanation. They said, here's what obviously happened. We know human beings could not have been living that far in the past. So here's what happened. Somebody must have gone to some Roman cemetery, cemetery about 2,000 years old or something, and they took a jawbone from one of the graves in that cemetery. Then they went to the excavation, planted it there, and that's how it happened. So Boucher de Perthes, he was just shocked, that anybody would dare, say he'd been a victim of a hoax like that. So what he did is very interesting. He conducted some new excavations at that place. And these excavations were witnessed by other scientists. And in these new excavations that were witnessed by other professional scientists, medical doctors, and others who were just watching, to make sure that nothing was strange was going on, nobody was sneaking in and throwing bones into the pit. And in these new excavations, they uncovered 100 additional anatomically modern human bones and teeth, which I believe confirmed that the original discovery was also genuine. But the thing is in the textbooks today, you only read this hoax story, and you never read about the additional excavations that were made and the 100 additional anatomically modern human bones and teeth that were found there. You do not read about that. All you read is the hoax story. Sort of like at Roswell, all you read about is the weather balloon story in the official accounts. You don't read about all the other evidence that's there. So I believe that those new discoveries, they confirm that the original one was made. So what you've got here is evidence that human beings like us were existing 430,000 years ago in Europe. And I would say it was some of those human beings who made those very advanced wooden throwing spears that were found by the German archaeologists in the 1990s. So, I gave a report about this whole case at a major international conference on history of science, and it was later published in the peer-reviewed conference proceedings volumes. So I think what we're going to do now, before we go on, we're going to go on to other cases. See, now we started out with 250,000 years at Huayatlaco. Now we're back to 430,000 years. We're going to keep going further and further back in time. We're going to go back to 1 million years, 10 million years, 100 million years over the course of the morning. So, but as promised, now I'm going to ask one more time for questions right now, and then we're going to take a break for 10 minutes or so, and then come back and go into the next level. The next level. So anybody have anything now? Any final question before the break? Okay. So let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll start up again at 9:40. Thank you. On Flores Island, and they published their report in Nature. Some of the artifacts they found there. The artifacts were found in this layer of their excavation, which was dated using the zircon fission track method as being about 800,000 years old. But again, they had to decide who made these things. And again, they decided, well, it could not have been human beings like us, because human beings like us did not exist 800,000 years ago. So who did exist 800,000 years ago in that part of the world? Again, the ape-man Homo erectus. So they decided, well, Homo erectus must have made those stone tools. But there was a problem with that. And the problem is that Flores Island is separated from the nearest land by wide expanses of ocean. Now this map shows the area as it looked about 800,000 years ago, at a time when the sea levels were lower than they are today. So you've got the coast of Southeast Asia, it comes out further. The coast of Australia comes out further, but still, I mean, it's separated from nearest land by wide expanses of ocean. So the problem is, how did the ape man, Homo erectus, get to Flores Island? So the archaeologists proposed something very radical. They proposed, well, he must have made a boat and sailed there. Now, I mean, this was a bit unusual because up to this time, nobody had ever thought the ape-man Homo erectus did any such thing. archaeologists and anthropologists believe that only human beings like us made boats and deliberately sailed across the ocean. And actually the oldest evidence they had for that was about 50,000 years old from some Mediterranean islands in Europe. Because in the Mediterranean Sea, there's some islands, there's some human remains there. So they proposed, well, they got there by boat, and that sort of fit. But to have this ape-man, Homo erectus, doing it 800,000 years ago was pretty unusual. But I think there's another answer to the question, who made the stone tools that were found on Flores Island, and how did he get there? And I think the answer lies in Java. Well, if we go back here, Java is here, it's part of Indonesia. And I think the answer to this question, who made those stone tools, lies here. It was in Java that the very first bones of Homo erectus were found in the 1890s by a Dutch scientist named Eugene Dubois. So he found this skull cap, very primitive skull cap, and he also found this thigh bone or femur. He put the two together, just these two bones, the skull cap, the femur, and said, here we have the Java ape man, which he originally called Pithecanthropus erectus, and today it's known as Homo erectus. And this is a very famous discovery. It's mentioned in all the textbooks, Java man. But here's something that we don't see mentioned in the textbooks. Some British scientists, they later carefully examined this femur, which supposedly belonged to the ape-man Homo erectus. And they did this in the 1970s. They said it's completely identical in every respect to a modern human thigh bone or femur. And they found it was completely different from any Homo erectus ape-man thigh bone that was found after this first one. So they concluded this thigh bone did not belong with that ape-man skull. Now that's kind of interesting because, this is their report about this, the human nature of this femur. It's published in the scientific journal. Now it's kind of unusual because according to Dubois, this is Dubois' map of where he found the bones. He found the skull cap and the femur in the exact same layer, which according to modern geologists is about 800,000 years old. So, what that suggests to me is there were two kinds of beings living in Java 800,000 years ago. Yeah, there were some ape men there. There were some Homo erectus ape men there, as indicated by this very primitive skull cap. But there were also some human beings like us living there 800,000 years ago, as shown by the anatomically modern human thigh bone or femur that was found in the exact same layer. And I would say it was members of that human population who made the boats, sailed across the seas to Flores Island, and left the stone tools there. So, say, whenever you go to a scientific conference, you have to have a joke slide. So when I went to, I presented everything I'm talking to you today about. I've presented at meetings of the World Archaeological Congress or the European Association of Archaeologists or other scientific conferences or scientific institutions. So what I tell the scientists is, look, we don't have to explain this evidence, we don't have to try to raise Homo erectus to the human level, which is what they try to do to explain, this evidence. There is evidence that humans like us were present 400,000 years ago in Europe, 800,000 years ago in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. So any questions about this case? Yes. How did the Java man get there? Depends who you're asking. How did he get to Java? Let's go back to the. Let's see. Go back to. Now, according to the standard theories, what you learn in the textbooks, they would say about a little over 2 million years ago, Homo erectus, this ape-man Homo erectus, was living in Africa. Left Africa, went to the Middle East, across the Middle East, then down into Southeast Asia. And see, at that time, when the sea levels were lower, Java was not an island as it is today. It was connected to the landmass of Asia. And so then that Homo erectus came down into Java. Some of them went north into China, like that. That's what the mainstream scientific explanation would be of how Java man got to Java. But they would think there were no human beings like us at that time. They would think maybe about maybe 1 million years ago or 1.5 million years ago, they got to Java, and they stayed there. So then they would think later, about 100,000 years ago, human beings like us first arose in Africa and then went out of Africa and wiped out all the ape men all over the world. That's what they would say. Yes?
I have a question. I've noticed in archaeological findings and that references are always made to ape men. Did they ever find ape women?
No, they never did. No, yes, of course they did. Well, let's just call them ape persons then. Will be. Yeah, I'm just using standard terminologies. To be, perfectly correct, we could call them. I mean, I didn't want to use technical terms like hominins. They have names. They have technical scientific names for. Trying to use the common terminologies for these people, and not burden everybody with a lot of, technical Latin names. But technically, they would be called hominins, and they'd be called early hominins, and they would have specific species names like Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus this, that, the other. So we could use the technical terminologies. But I think for our purposes, we can use ape people if we like. A very good point. Excellent point. But yes, they can tell. Of course, this even comes up in modern. If you watch these television shows like CSI and stuff like that, you can learn some things about how they identify skeletons as male or female. There are certain features that will allow them to, as they call sex, the skeletons. But yes, they do find female remains as well. Also, infant remains, and they find all kinds of things. But to get back to the point, they would say, the Homo erectus arose in Africa, spread throughout Asia, Europe. Then they would say about between 100 and 200,000 years ago, human beings like us arose in Africa, and then they went out and they wiped out everybody else. The Neanderthals, the Homo erectus, wiped them out. What I'm proposing is that if we look carefully, we see there's evidence that humans like us were existing at the same time as these supposed human ancestors, like Homo erectus, the Neanderthals, the Australopithecines. Just like here in Java, you've got evidence that humans were existing, humans like us were existing, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, sapiens, that's what they're called technically. So that's how they would say, Java man got to Java. Okay, so we got back to about 800,000 years with evidence for anatomically modern humans. And now we're going to go to Buenos Aires, where in the early part of the 20th century, an anatomically modern human skull was found. And it was found here. This is 15 meters, about 15 yards, 45 feet below the surface. Then they found this, they encountered this, a thick layer of limestone rock, which they call, in Spanish, tosca, like a very thick layer of limestone rock. And then they broke through that layer, and then they found the skull directly below that, a human skull. And it was found in the Pre-Encenadan Formation, which according to modern geologists is 1.5 million years old. That's the age of the formation below the limestone layer. And it's an anatomically modern human skull. Now this detail here, that there's this thick layer of hard limestone rock, is very important. Because that means that that skull cannot have come down from some higher, more recent level. That's the usual kind of counter-explanation that's given. You've got a human skull and some very ancient layer of rock. Well, it came down through some crack or fissure from some higher level. That's why you think, you found some human bone and some very, very ancient layer of rock. Now, what rules that out is the presence of this unbroken layer of limestone rock that completely sealed off the skull from the surface. So here what we've got is a human skull, 1.5 million years old. And this discovery was reported to the scientific world by Florentino Ameghino, who was a very prominent South American scientist, Argentine scientist. Now this is an interesting case. There's this shell that has a simple but very recognizable human face carved on it. It was found in the year 1881 by the British geologist Henry Stopes, who reported on it at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And today, scientists think that the first carved bones and things like that go back only about 77,000 years. This is what they consider to be the oldest sign of deliberate human artwork on bone or shell, going back. And you can see it's very simple, just some lines scratched on a piece of bone. But really, such evidence goes much further back in time than that, because that shell, that carved shell, was found at this place, Walton-on-Naze, in the east coast of England. It was found in the Red Crag Formation, which goes back about 2 million years. So here you've got evidence of a carved shell with a human face carved on it, about 2 million years old. So you can see how we're going further and further back in time. This is the beach at Walton-on-Naze, and this is the Red Crag Formation here. You can see it's a reddish color, and that's where this shell was discovered. And you can still see shells there today. These shells are over 2 million years old. But you can see that these are plain. They don't have anything carved on them. So one suggestion is, well, maybe somebody just took one of these shells, carved a little human face on it, and that's the explanation. It's not really, there wasn't anybody around 2 million years ago to carve the face on the human shell. Somebody just went there recently and took the shell out, carved a little face on it, and that's the explanation. But what rules that out is these shells are very, very delicate. Like I said, they're 2 million years old, and they are so delicate that if you tried to carve them, they would just crumble to dust. So that explanation really doesn't work. And this is the daughter of Henry Stopes. Like after her father announced this discovery, some people made this claim that no, it's really not a human carving from 2 million years ago. Somebody just took a little shell from the beach and carved a little face on it and gave it to your father, who's a professional geologist and knows all about these things. And so she said, no, that's, she's the one who pointed out that these shells are so delicate that if anybody had tried to do that, they would have just crumbled into dust. And she further pointed out that that if somebody had tried to do that, the surface would have looked different than the present surface of the shell. It was so she gave a very detailed explanation why that explanation really wouldn't work. Now, there's some additional reasons for thinking there may have been human beings around in that part of England around 2 million years ago to carve the shell. In the 19th century, an anatomically modern human jaw was found at a place called Foxhall, which is sort of in the same part of England. It's near Ipswich here. And this is Foxhall Hall, which is on the outskirts of Ipswich. And somebody was doing some excavations there, and they found this anatomically modern human jaw in the Red Crag Formation, the same Red Crag Formation that the shell, carved shell, was found in. And that's about 2 million years old. So then after that, in the early 20th century, around 1920, an English researcher went there, and it looks like we've lost this. So the question is, what does the depth at which an object or bone is found have to do with its age? That depends on the particular situations. Generally, like geology is based on the idea that if things are in their normal order, the deeper layers would be the older ones. But how old they are depends on a lot of things, because there can be situations in which layers could accumulate very rapidly. So, for example, when there have been these catastrophic events like Mount St. Helens going off, huge amounts of volcanic ash come out and they accumulate very, very rapidly. So you can get just hundreds of feet of deposits accumulate very, very rapidly. So that means even something found very deep in them wouldn't necessarily be that old. So a lot depends on the ability of scientists to date, the different layers. For example, at Wyatt-Locko, there were some volcanic layers above the layer of stone tools. So that they were able to use the zircon fission track method to date that layer of volcanic ash as being, about over 300,000 years old. That means anything under it must be at least that old. The same thing like with this skull found in Buenos Aires. There was a layer of rock above it that was unbroken that was able to be dated. So a lot depends on the situation. Of course, there are some cases where older layers can be shoved over, older layers can be shoved over newer layers. So a lot depends on the dating of the different layers, if that can be done. But in some cases, in general, the deeper a thing is, the older it is. That's the general rule.
So that generally presupposes that the Earth is getting bigger?
What it presupposes is that fossils, artifacts are generally found in what's called layers of sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock is rock like sandstone, limestone. It's originally mud or sand or something like that that gets deposited by rivers or
The
lakes.
idea is
Or
that this is moved in on top of it?
no, there's different. Say like, if you have a river, for example, and each year it floods. And when it floods, it lays down a layer of sediment. And then the next year, it may lay down sediment on top of that. So over the course of many years, you get many layers of sediments being laid down. And then maybe at a certain point, there's some earth movements, that raise the whole thing up. And so the river is no longer there. And then those things will turn into, gradually over time, layers of stone.
Layers are getting one on top of the other. The earth must be.
But there's also erosion going on too, at the same
really
time.
more movement, not the whole thing getting moved.
No, I mean like erosion can take place. I mean layers of sediment can be laid down, but then erosion can come and wear them down again. If you look at the whole geological history of the Earth, the way that geologists look at it, mountains are raised, they're kind of worn down, and the deposits that were once mountains are kind of deposited in valleys and things like that. And then mountains come up again, and geologists tell us that 90% of the sedimentary layers that have ever been laid down are now gone. They've been worn away by erosion and other geological processes. So, okay, we're back.
For a while.
Okay. Okay. Which is really interesting because these fossils are deposited in layers of sedimentary rock. And they're constantly being deposited and eroded. And geologists tell us that over 90% of the sedimentary layers that have ever been laid down on Earth are now gone, which means we don't really have a complete record, of the history of life on Earth. It's like, say you have a book, it's 1,000 pages long, and then you just rip out 900 of those pages. You don't have the whole story. And then there's the problem of knowledge filtering. The people that are looking sometimes have their ideas about what should be there and what shouldn't be there. If things don't fit their theory, then they ignore those. So there really isn't a complete record, for us to really examine. But if we carefully look at everything that is there. And what I've tried to do is show you things that are there, but you're not going to find in the textbooks. Say, I remember when I went to school, I looked at the theory. There's the theory of evolution. Here's the evidence. The evidence matches the theory, so I had no reason to question it. It must be true because, well, here are all the facts. Here's what the theory says. The facts go along with the theory must be true. No reason to question it, no reason to doubt it. It really wasn't until, I started looking into things and discovering that actually the textbooks aren't presenting all the facts. I was really surprised when I started this research. I thought, I just had some suspicions from my study of different ancient wisdom traditions or even the Bible, well, that things could be different than what we're being told in the textbooks. And I thought, well, let me look and see if there is any evidence that shows, for example, that human beings have been here for millions and millions of years. I thought, okay, I might find, a couple of interesting cases, one or two, and, I'll just write a short little article about them, and then I'll go on to something else. But when I started this, I thought I might do about 8 days of research. I just might start looking into different archives and things like that, find a few interesting facts, write a short little article about it, and then go on to something else. But I found, when I started that research, the 8 days turned into 8 weeks. The 8 weeks turned into 8 months. The 8 months turned into 8 years. Because yes, I did find a few cases, but those led to other cases. There would be some little footnote. Yes, some scientist in Europe, he claimed to have found, this something or other skeleton, but it's complete nonsense. Well, I would follow up on that little footnote. I'd go look up his report, see if it really was nonsense. I find, well, it wasn't nonsense. He was a very, very reputable scientist. He'd done very careful work. He'd found something that showed human beings were present a very long time ago in a very convincing way. And then he would mention, some other little discovery that somebody else had made. And then I'd follow that out. And then I'd follow that and that and that. And it took me about 8 years to kind of get to the point where I really wasn't finding a whole lot more. But in that 8 years of research, I compiled enough evidence to kind of fill up a 900-page book, which Luke here got somewhere along the line. It's called Forbidden Archeology. Some people call it forbidding archaeology because, it's a little heavy. But you could work out with it. You could get some exercise. Yeah.
Question. In your search, for your discoveries and everything like that, your resources, were they the library? Were they the internet, the information highway? Were they?
Well, I started this research. So the question is, how was this research done? So I started this research in the 1980s, before there really was, a very highly developed internet. And even today, you're not going to find a lot of this stuff on the internet, which leads to, this is Lori Erbs here, my research assistant, who is, professionally trained librarian with a Master's of Science, Master of Library Science from, University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she was running a scientific, before, she started helping me in my research. She was running a scientific research laboratory for library, scientific research library for an agency of the U.S. government, the Forest Service in Alaska. And she'd found out about the work of my colleague and I, Richard Thompson, and asked if there were anything she could do to help out. So to get the kind of, most of my research has been looking for old, out-of-print documents, rare scientific journals in all different languages from all over the world. And getting this kind of stuff is not easy. You have to know where these things are, how to get them. So for that sort of thing, Laurie's been absolutely essential. And there are others too that have also helped. With the research for the book. But my ongoing research, it really depends a lot on people like Laurie especially, and then also when I'm on radio shows and things like that, people will call in and give leads. I've learned a lot from meetings like this. People come, well, my uncle was a coal miner, and he found something, and he showed it to the foreman, and the foreman said, "Shut up about that." The information, I'm doing what you might say an archaeology of archaeology. And basically, I've been looking for documented studies. And now once I have that, then I often go to the museums and try to find the artifacts and get pictures of them and go visit the original sites and try to relocate the sites and things like that. But the foundation for the kind of research that I do means going into all kinds of archives all over the world where there's rare out-of-print documents and things that you're not going to find on the internet even. And somebody who knows library systems, information systems can be very helpful.
And you're dealing with knowledge filtration too.
Yes. And I'm going to be explaining some cases like that, explaining some of the difficulties that there are in getting access to this information. I mean, it's what you see in films like Raiders of the Lost Ark, going into the Smithsonian, like the basements of the Smithsonian. It may seem like, well, it's all just Hollywood, but it is a fact that there are hidden archives, there are things like that. Definitely. And I'm going to be touching on some of those cases as we go on. So to kind of stick to our schedule, we'll take another 10-minute break now. And if you all come back in 10 minutes, we'll go further back in time. We can see we've already broken the 1 million year barrier, the 2 million year barrier. So we're going to go back even further in time. So, we were talking about the discoveries of J. Reed Moore in the Foxhall area. Just a little reminder, we had that carved shell which was found in eastern England, about 2 million years old. The human jaw that was found also in eastern England at about 2 million years old. All the stone tools that were found by J. Reed Moore at Foxhall in the same layer where the human jaw was found in the Red Crag Formation, again about 2 million years old. So they all fit together. Human jaw, carved shell, human-made tools. So there was an American anthropologist named Henry Fairfield Osborn who wrote in 1920, "The discoveries of J. Reed Moore of evidence of the existence of Pliocene man in East Anglia open a new epoch in archaeology." The Pliocene is a geological period that goes back about 2 million years. So he's pointing out, yes, these are very important discoveries. They show they bring indubitable evidence of the existence of man in southeast Britain, man of sufficient intelligence to fashion flints and build fire before the close of the Pliocene. So these discoveries were being very widely advertised in the scientific world in the 1920s, showing the existence of human beings in England going back over 2 million years. But then gradually these things started disappearing, from the textbooks. Scientists stopped talking about them. And today, you won't read anything like that in the textbooks. So go back to Argentina, back to South America. Some interesting discoveries were made at a place called Miramar on the Atlantic coast of Argentina, a little south of Buenos Aires. And the discoveries were made at this place on the seashore, a little bit north of the town of Miramar. There are some cliffs on the seashore, and in these cliffs there are many animal bones. And this is the interesting discovery. This is not a human bone. It's the bone of an extinct South American mammal called a toxodon. A toxodon would be kind of like a little hippopotamus with fur on it. It's an extinct mammal. You don't see them in South America anymore. And the most interesting feature of this bone is that it has a flint arrowhead solidly embedded in it. And this bone is 3 million years old. So archaeologists believe that arrows, bow and arrow, that's a weapon made only by humans like us, not by any kind of ape man at all. So you've got this flint arrowhead solidly embedded in a toxodon bone that's 3 million years old. So this discovery was reported to the scientific world by Carlos Ameghino, who is the brother of Florentino, who had announced the discovery of the human skull from Buenos Aires that was 1.5 million years old. So this discovery was very, very controversial. So, as I said, a lot of scientists, they had problems with this discovery. Couldn't believe that humans existed 3 million years ago. So one of them, Eric Beaumont, who is a prominent scientist from South America, said, here's what happened. Somebody got a 3 million year old toxodon femur, thigh bone. Then that person went to like an old Indian settlement about a couple thousand years old, picked up a flint arrowhead. Then he took that flint arrowhead and he pounded it into the 3 million year old toxodon bone. And then he took the bone with the arrowhead and he planted it in the excavation for Carlos Ameghino to find. I mean, you kind of see you see how this works. So Carlos Ameghino said, all right. So what he did is he said, okay, I would like you and a whole bunch of other scientists to come to this place and you conduct some excavations and see what you find. So they got the leading South American scientists to come to this site at Miramar. They had archaeologists who were expert in judging whether things were made by humans or not. They had geologists who were expert in judging the strata. They had paleontologists who were expert at looking at the animal bones. And they conducted new excavations at this same site. And they were very, very careful. Like Carlos Ameghino, he let the skeptics conduct the excavations. So they started conducting some new excavations, and he said, okay, you very sure nobody's dug anything here or planted anything? And they said, no, this is undisturbed. We can see it's undisturbed strata. So they started digging into the side of the cliff. And they dug about 5 feet into the side of the cliff. And they discovered human artifacts in the layers of solid rock. And they photographed them in place. You know, they always ask for this. Oh, were the artifacts photographed in place? Yes, in this case. And what they found were bola stones. Now, these bola stones are round stones that have a groove carved around the center. And they're a weapon. They can be used for hunting. You know, you tie some of these stones together with a cord or a piece of leather, and you can throw them and catch birds, small mammals, and things like that. It's the kind. It's a weapon that's still used in Argentina today, and according to anthropologists and archaeologists, it's a weapon that's only made and used by humans like us. They don't think any kind of ape man is capable of doing these things. The same layers that the original Toxodon thigh bone with the flint arrowhead were found in. 3 million years old. And this formation here is 3 million years old. Actually, scientists still go there for the animal bones that are found. But what's most interesting from my point of view is not just the animal bones that are found there, but the human tools and the animal bones with flint arrowheads in and things like that show there was a human presence in South America 3 million years ago. And as I said, these discoveries were made in the direct presence of the skeptic who had proposed it was a hoax. Really interesting, well-documented case. You couldn't want a better documented case. The artifacts photographed in place, professional geologists, paleontologists, and archaeologists present, skeptics present. You couldn't want a better documented case for evidence for extreme human antiquity than this. So, anyone have any questions at this point? Yes.
How does stone layer form that covers all the bones?
These are formations. They're called aeolian foundation formations, which means they were the bones were originally deposited by wind-blown sand and dust in this part of South America. That means, okay, there was like a plain somewhere. Some animals were there, humans were there. The animals died, the human beings left their stone tools. And then over the course of many thousands of years, there's dust blowing, sand blowing and being laid down, covering it. And then over time, those layers of sand and dust, they turn into rock. So that's what happened here. In some cases, some places it's waterborne deposits. Some places you've got wind deposits like this, and it happens over the course of many thousands of years. So what happened in this case, as I said, was these animals died, the humans left their tools and things, and then gradually they were covered by layers of wind-blown sand that were blowing from the central part of southern South America, from the deserts and things there, dropping these layers of dust and sand on them.
Like Neanderthal and Homo erectus, do they have tools and weapons like that as well?
Archaeologists and anthropologists do not believe they were using bows and arrows and things like that. they believe they may have been using some very, very primitive tools, but not like bola stones, bows and arrows, and things like that. According to their ideas, those things would have been used by humans like us. And practically speaking, that's what we find. I mean, you find even a chimpanzee can take a rock and break open a nut or something like that. Even birds, will use little tools, little sticks and things, or so even animals will sometimes make use of some very, very primitive tools. But for things like bows and arrows, bola stones, most scientists would say, practically they'd be unanimous in saying that only humans like us made and used those kinds of things, which may lead, and sometimes people might wonder, well, what about, didn't they have computers in those days, or 3 million years ago? But they might have had computers in those days. But the problem is, say, okay, you're talking about 3 million years ago. All right. Well, what if they did have laptop computers 3 million years ago? Problem is this stuff does not preserve very well because the plastics will dissolve. There are museums today where they've been trying to preserve plastic objects. Because our plastics are about 100 years old, basically, most of them. And they're finding a hard time preserving the earliest plastic objects in museums because they're just turning to dust. They don't last a long time. The metals, most metals will oxidize. So this kind of, a flint arrowhead isn't going to go anywhere. It'll last 3 million years. A laptop computer is not going to last for 3 million years. So they might have had laptop computers 3 million years ago, but so it's not that I'm saying that millions of years ago there were only primitive people using stone tools and stone weapons. It's just the unfortunate fact that the kind of stuff that we consider high tech doesn't preserve very well over many millions of years. There have been some documentaries recently connected with the environmental crisis, and they're based on this idea. What if humans disappeared today? How long would the remains of our civilization last? And the scientists who've studied this question very carefully said not very long. But we may think, well, what about these huge cities, with skyscrapers and all this? It seems like very permanent, but actually it's not. I mean, most of our big cities are located either on the ocean or on the banks of rivers. And those rivers are kept in their place by dams, levees, seawalls, things like that. Without human beings to maintain that stuff, the dams will break eventually, the seawalls will break, the levees will, and then the rivers will start flowing as they used to, wherever they want to go, huge floods. We also rely on our fire departments, to kind of like if a fire starts, well, you get all the firemen there, they put it out. If there's no human beings around, the fires are just going to blaze uncontrolled. There would be floods, rivers. We kind of think that concrete is a very permanent substance, but actually it rots. And actually we think, oh, but what about the steel girders. Actually, after some time, they'll start to rust. When steel girders start to rust, they expand. They'll break the concrete off of them. They'll fall down. After several thousands of years, there's not going to be very much left. What to speak of after millions of years. So I just wanted to throw that out there because sometimes, yeah.
Regarding a lot of these skeptics that you've come across, in your research, I was wondering if you found any common themes between them with regard to, say, their associations, privately, belief systems, etc.
Yes, I do seem to see some common associations because.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, so the question is, sorry, I promised I would and I forgot. Thanks for reminding me. The question is, when I'm looking at the critics and the skeptics that I encounter in my work, do I notice among them any sorts of common themes or associations? And yes, I do note some kind of common themes and associations. Basically, what I'm doing is I'm presenting evidence that contradicts the current theories of human origins. And that means, really, we need to start looking for alternatives. And the alternatives generally involve something non-material. The idea that there is some kind of designer and controller of the universe, that there are powers that go beyond, strictly material forces and things like that. When you start getting into the alternatives, that's what you get into. There's intelligent design, there's creationism, there's the different ancient wisdom traditions, there's subtle powers and things like that. Those are the kinds of things you get into when you get beyond the stones and bones, so to speak. And I think there are a lot of people that in this world who don't want to see things go in that direction. They would rather see things where everybody's sort of working happily, doing their jobs, paying their taxes, consuming, not getting interested in all this other stuff that might distract them from the important business of producing and consuming more and more material things so that governments can collect the tax money, big corporations can collect the profits, scientists can collect their share. So I think there are a lot of forces in the world that just want to keep things in place. The status quo, from which a lot of people have learned to profit. And the way they do that is by keeping people pretty much focused on material production and consumption. And there's a whole system worked out for that, so that if it's even slightly disturbed, then all the governments, everybody gets in a big tizzy. How can we put things back in shape? Because otherwise, if you let people start just doing whatever they want, they're not going to be doing the things that are keeping the political, economic, social, cultural institutions in place. So yeah, I think that's sort of a common theme that I notice. But there's a huge amount that could be said about that, but that's one thing that I notice. Okay. So we'll go on a little bit further back in time now. In 1979, Mary Leakey, who was a very prominent archaeologist, discovered some footprints at a place called Laetoli in the country of Tanzania in East Africa. And in her original report, which was published in National Geographic magazine, she said, "These footprints are indistinguishable from modern human footprints." In other words, they look just like the footprints that you or I would make if we were walking on a beach or in the sand somewhere. Now, that's kind of interesting because the footprints were found in layers of rock 3,700,000 years old, almost 4 million years old. And other scientists also agreed with Mary Leakey. You know, there's a very famous paleontologist called Tim White. He said, "Make no mistake about it, they are like modern human footprints." And he said this, and he's quoted in this book, you know, Lucy, which is about a famous ape woman. Lucy, an Australopithecus afarensis. So practically everyone who's looked, every scientist who's looked at these footprints has said they are like modern human footprints, exactly. But now neither Mary Leakey nor Tim White believe that humans like us were present 4 million years ago to make these footprints. So how do they explain the footprints? Oh, it's just another scientist who says they're indistinguishable from modern human footprints. So they say the footprints are exactly like modern human footprints, but they don't believe that humans like us were present 4 million years ago. So what's the explanation? The explanation, they say, is this. 4 million years ago, there must have been some kind of ape people who had feet exactly like modern human feet, and that's how the footprints were made. Now that's an interesting proposal. That would explain it. Unfortunately, there's no physical evidence to support that idea. You know, we have the skeletons of the ape people who lived at that time, 4 million years ago. They're called Australopithecus. And the foot structure of Australopithecus is not like that of a modern human being. It's very ape-like. You know, for example, the big toe moves out to the side like a human thumb, and the other toes are long, sort of like short human fingers. So the foot of Australopithecus is very ape-like. It's not like that of a modern human being at all. Actually, the only creature known to science today that has a foot exactly like that of a modern human being is a human being like us. Now, maybe in the future, okay, maybe somebody will find some ape person that has a foot exactly like a modern human foot, but that has not happened up to this moment in time. The only creature known to science that has a foot just like that of a modern human being is a human being like us. So what did Mary Leakey actually find? I would say she found evidence that humans like us were present 4 million years ago.